Today we're reviewing the AMD RX 6800 XT video card. This is positioned directly against NVIDIA's RTX 3080. It's priced about $50 below it, and it's the head-to-head competitor. In this review, we'll be looking at the rasterization performance for standard gaming, RT performance. We'll be going through smart access memory and acoustics, thermals, frequency validation, RPM versus frequency and thermal validation, all that stuff, and plenty more. Before that, this video is brought to you by Crucial Ballistics Memory, including the nuke hits targeted for use with AMD's new Ryzen 5000 CPUs. Crucial's new Ballistics Max memory is some of the highest performing memory on the market and can be tuned for timings and clocks to improve performance. The company also has its other Crucial Ballistics kits for a more affordable entry to enthusiast-grade memory. Crucial is a Micron brand and has direct access to its own memory supply. Learn more at the link in the description below. So for this thing, this one in particular is about $50 under the 3080. It's supposed to be $650. The reference cards are launching first from AMD directly. Partner models will sort of trickle out slowly over the following couple, 2 to 3 weeks from what we're told right now. You might see some popping up within the first week or so, but that's about the delay for the partner models. And for our content, we have already a pretty in-depth thermal follow-up, so we'll do a whole bunch of ways you can kind of upgrade the reference cooler, because it's not great, really. So we have follow-up content for that. We've also got some content for water cooling for more extreme overclocking, but we've done overclocking in this review as well. As far as the specs, well, we're gonna point you towards our video for the launch, but we'll also pop up a spec sheet on the screen briefly. So this review is crammed with information. We don't wanna read through just the spec sheet for it. We have a teardown coming up same day. We have an RX 6800 non-XT review coming up same day as well. It will be easily within 24 hours of this review going live, and follow-up testing shortly thereafter, including a live stream sometime in the next day or so. The test matrix has ballooned like crazy because of smart access memory, so we've cut some stuff we normally have in reviews to replace it with smart access memory testing. The basics of it is that if you have a Ryzen 5000 CPU, a 500 series motherboard like X570, and then an RX 6000 series GPU, you can get the CPU can more directly address the GPU memory and improve performance in some cases. This is done with some driver level stuff, some SBIOS level stuff, and NVIDIA is working on its own PCIe resizable BAR for the future, but it doesn't have it today. So for today, we're doing SAM testing with AMD on versus off versus NVIDIA on an AMD platform. And then we also have our standard test platform on Intel, which once you have those higher resolutions, all the CPUs are gonna be the same anyway once you're looking at 4K. So, a lot to go through. Let's get into the testing numbers. We need to start out by validating the frequency range to ensure the device is operating as expected. Please note that this chart is intentionally zoomed to a tight range of 250 megahertz in order to better see the behavior, but it does make the changes look more blown out. We're assuming the reported frequency is the clock domain for the GPU, but we have a suspicion that it might be something else. Either way though, all that matters is that we're measuring the same frequency for all of these tests, and we discourage comparing frequency to frequency between devices. Just like in CPUs, there's a lot more to it than just the frequency number. The 6800 XT stock frequency in our standard repeat frame render benchmark plots at 2340 to 2355 megahertz after an extended test period, but the initial frequency spiked at launch is 2450 megahertz and then 2375 megahertz, and then a rapid decay as the temperature rises. This is expected behavior of all GPUs currently in the gaming card market, including NVIDIA's. Enabling rage mode doesn't appear to do much of anything. The frequency increases by maybe 10 to 20 megahertz, but that line doesn't flatten in any meaningful way, and that's really what we'd want to see. This aligns with what AMD told us to expect of rage mode though, which was maybe a 1 to 2% increase. Remember, rage mode just lifts the power budget slightly. It doesn't even max it out, and it increases the aggression of the fan curve. So it's not technically overclocking anything. It's just affording more power budget for native clock boosting behavior. This next chart shows the thermal PWM response of fans for each mode. Tested fully stock, the auto RPM and a repeat render gaming workload is about 1630 RPM, with occasional 10 RPM dips, so those don't matter. Enabling rage mode does boost the fan curve, as AMD said, settling now at 1760 RPM. We'll go over what that means for noise in a moment, but the impact to thermals is a change of about 3 degrees Celsius for T-junction hotspot temperature, which is noteworthy when considering the RPM increase. The average GPU temperature also sees about a 4-degree swing, except rage mode is running lower than stock as a result of its fan RPM increase. Overall, this mode does run hotter for the hotspot and a higher RPM for a minor frequency increase. We normally do pressure map testing to illustrate how the cooler secures against the GPU, which is helpful in determining the thermal performance and the contact patch. We also typically show cold plate flatness to show the point-to-point depth in microns. For this one though, we're going to skip past those for a follow-up piece instead. We're halfway through additional thermal tests on how to improve the overall mediocre AMD reference solution, so you'll see the pressure and flatness data there. That's also where we'll show the 40 dBA noise normalized thermals, but this one, with the addition of SAM and RT testing, it was just too much. Here's a quick map of the acoustic response for the 6800 XT, and the 6800 for that matter. The auto fan speeds had it in the range of 41 dBA already on this curve, but the curve is fairly predictable and terminates at 57.4 dBA. Pretty standard for coolers. As always, this high number will only happen if you manually adjust to 100% fan speed, so you don't need to worry about it, but it does give you some extra cooling push if needed. We couldn't measure below 900 RPM due to the limitations of our 26 dB noise floor, but overall, for the auto speeds in our test environment, it lands around the 40 to 41 mark. Before we get into the standard game suite with all of the GPUs on the charts, including about a dozen or so other ones, we want to start with validating SAM, or Smart Access Memory. We started with just a subset of games for some quick A/B testing here. These were selected randomly from our existing test suite, except for Hitman 2 at 4K Ultra, which we chose specifically because AMD claimed an unusually high 10% performance increase from enabling SAM. Our standard Ryzen CPU test bench was used for these tests, along with a Gigabyte X570 Master with 3200 MHz 14/14/14 memory, and an AMD R9 5900X locked at 4.7 GHz all-core. SAM testing gets off to a promising start with Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, where the 6800 XT was initially tied with the MSRP priced RTX 3080 Eagle. Enabling SAM resulted in only a 3.5% uplift versus stock at 213 FPS versus 206 FPS average, with the lows unchanged. That's still enough for it to pull ahead of the NVIDIA card, and now 3% ahead of the 3080's 207 FPS average. Given that this is an AMD platform, it also means that we have more headroom in CPU-bound 1080p scenarios than Intel often offers, although many of our GPU test settings do ensure a bind even at the lower resolutions. But it's not always the case that AMD won't end up CPU bound. Moving to 4K shows the same order of results, albeit with a much reduced average frame rate. The 3080 is 1.7% ahead of the 6800 XT without SAM at 92 FPS versus 94 average, but enabling SAM flips that order and puts the 6800 XT 1.8% ahead instead. These aren't noticeable differences in game, but it is enough to give AMD a competitive edge in some instances, and certainly enough to change the order in the charts. As with all of these tests, except Hitman 2, Red Dead Redemption 2 was chosen without any knowledge of predicted performance. AMD's testing suggests some small performance scaling may be possible in Red Dead, at least when using Vulkan, but we happened to choose DX12 in this instance and saw no significant change in performance at 1080p. That said, we also have Vulkan tested later on in the test suite. The 6800 XT was already 2.1% ahead of the RTX 3080 in this benchmark, and the average with SAM enabled was 2.4% ahead, an improvement of less than 1 FPS average, well within variance and run-to-run deviation. There is no change in this title and this API. Further still, AMD's lead is a result of running against a CPU limitation in this particular title, and so is artificial in that both GPUs are bouncing off of the frame rate limit. Moving to 4K instead reveals the CPU bottleneck we hit at 1080p, with the RTX 3080 now 13% ahead of the 6800 XT. That doesn't change the results from enabling SAM though, which is what we're testing mostly in this section. There was still no significant change, actually basically no change at all, to AMD's results with or without it. We abbreviated the other game tests for this section to 1080p and 4K only, but selected the Three Kingdoms Battle benchmark as the one game for SAM testing where we run 1440p as well. The first pass at 1080p had the RTX 3080 2.8% ahead of the 6800 XT, but SAM reduced that gap to 1.2%. At 1440p, the performance gap between NVIDIA and AMD grew, with the 3080 5.5% ahead of the stock 6800 XT, but then reduced to 5.2% ahead with SAM enabled. That had them at 90 FPS average for AMD and 95 FPS average for NVIDIA. NVIDIA seems to hold a ROPS and a bandwidth advantage as well. Running the test at 4K placed the 3080 at 50 FPS average, 11.9% of the 6800 XT. The efficacy of SAM dwindled at this resolution, only reducing the 3080's performance advantage to 11.1%. The 3080 did suffer from worse 1% and 0.1% lows at this resolution as compared to some others, with the 6800 XT's relatively stable 38 FPS-ish lows actually technically beating the 3080's lows. Rainbow Six Siege's behavior was unusual from the norm, but is something we've seen in our other GPU suite on the other platform. We'll get to those numbers soon. At 1080p, the 6800 XT had a respectable 7.8% lead over the 3080 Eagle. That's 495 FPS average versus 459 FPS average, with no change from SAM, which is impressively consistent given how high the average frame rates are. We were suspicious of a potential 500 FPS engine limit given how close these averages are, so we checked the frame times and saw that there were periods during the test where it would push past 500 FPS. It appears that there is no limit here, at least in our test setup. At 4K, the advantage flipped to NVIDIA by a wide margin, thanks again to its memory bandwidth and advantages there. The RTX 3080 was 20.5% ahead of the 6800 XT, and still no change with SAM enabled, even in the 1% and 0.1% lows. Average FPS with SAM off was 153.91, and average FPS with SAM on was 153.96. Our final test is one we added to validate the claim that there are some games with a large performance scaling with SAM. We tested only at 4K, since that's where AMD's numbers showed the largest change. The original results resemble Tomb Raiders for Hitman 2, with the 3080 and 6800 XT tied at just over 100 FPS average. Enabling SAM raised the 6800 XT's performance above both of those non-SAM tests by 10.6%, up to 111 FPS average, with a modest improvement in the 1% lows as well, from 57 to 64. The takeaway is that SAM is hit and miss. This matches with what NVIDIA told us about its future implementation. The company is considering implementing a whitelist or a blacklist for certain games based on whether or not those games actually benefit from enabling a resizable PCIe BAR. Moving back to our standard GPU test bench, we'll start with Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K with the full suite of cards. The 6800 XT stock card plotted at about 93 FPS average on this platform, which isn't comparable to our SAM tests and platform, and therefore ranked technically ahead of the RTX 3080 FE card. Overclocking the FE leapfrogged it over the 6800 XT stock just barely, and overclocking the 6800 XT did the same thing, putting it back in a technical lead. Ultimately, these two produce roughly the same experience at 4K, which is more of a statement for AMD than it is for NVIDIA at this point. The 6800 XT OC gains 2.6% over the stock 6800 XT, so not great in this title. Compared to the 1080 Ti FTW3, the older Pascal card is led by 84% in this scenario, and the 5700 XT is led similarly by the 6800 XT. As for Rage Mode, that improved performance by negative 0.2 FPS average. It's within run-to-run variance, and was unhelpful in doing anything other than running the fan louder. The 1440p results position the 6800 XT stock card as 6.5% ahead of the 3080 FE, a decisive victory here, with the overclock producing enough of an upswing to bring it above the 3090 FE stock results from the original review. The 172 FPS average is a 4.7% improvement over the stock 6800 XT, posting a significantly higher benefit than the 2.6% we saw at 4K, but it's still not amazing for an overclock compared to the older days of overclocking GPUs out of the box. Rage Mode, again, did nothing here. At 1080p, we're completely CPU bound and cannot determine a meaningful difference between any of the top results. They're all bouncing off of the CPU limit, and so this data is about as useful as testing CPUs at 4K. It's helpful only in saying that if you're playing at 1080p with one of these high-end cards, it's the CPU that matters more, unless you're extremely GPU bound with settings that aren't available in this title, but might be in, say, Total War. Rage Mode shows marginal uplift, but this is CPU bound anyway, so it's invalid. Total War 3 Kingdoms is up next, tested with the punishing ultra settings at 4K. Nothing has cracked 60 FPS in this test yet, thanks to the somewhat needlessly high graphic settings we've configured, but that allows us to see the most scaling going forward. Here, the 6800 XT stock card did 42.5 FPS average, improving by 6.8% with the 6800 XT OC to 45 FPS average. The RTX 3080 FE ran at 47 here, a lead of 10.4% over the 6800 XT stock card. Compared to the 5700 XT's 23 FPS average, but with a 1080 Ti's similar frame rate, the 6800 XT is about 84–85% ahead. The most noticeable thing happening here is the 1% and 0.1% lows being disproportionately better for the RX 6000 series cards, with the 30 series cards running fine, but aligned much worse against their average versus what the 6800 is seeing. We'll need a Frametime plot for that though. Here's a look at the Frametime plot. Lower is better, but more consistent is best. The RX 6800 XT stock card plotted within a range of about 3 to 4 milliseconds, which is excellent frametime consistency overall from one frame to the next. The frame times are overall higher by nature of this being 4K, but the consistency is good. And remember that frame times in a plot like this are the best way that we currently have to show an empirical look at the frame-to-frame performance of gameplay. NVIDIA's consistency at the start of this test is all over the place. It's not experience ruining, a spike to or beyond, for example, 100 milliseconds would be, but it's not great either. The card is bouncing around in 5 to 10 millisecond swings, with a few swings closer to point-to-point 12 to 14 milliseconds. This particular game showed this behavior in the SAM tests on the AMD platform as well, which is an entirely different operating system and a technically newer driver for NVIDIA, so this is present on both platforms. At 1440p, the 6800 XT stock card did 88 FPS average with Rage Mode, again, within variance and about as anticlimactic as possible for something named Rage Mode. Overclocking improves it to 94.5 FPS average, or 7%, which is enough to roughly equal the RTX 3080 FEOC. The 3080 FE stock card did 93 FPS average, which leads the 6800 XT stock card by about 5.3%. At 1080p, we're not bound by the CPU for this game, so we still see scaling. The frame time consistency improves here, leading us to believe something else screwy is going on with the pacing at those higher resolutions for NVIDIA, but AMD is still technically ahead on average for its low performance. The 6800 XT stock did 140 FPS average, with Rage Mode providing zero value whatsoever. The 6800 XT OC improved 5.2% to 147 FPS average, putting it between the 3090 FE stock card and the 3080 FE OC. Stock to stock, the 3080 FE is technically in the lead, but thus far the card differences in average FPS aren't too meaningful. Horizon Zero Dawn at 4K is next, with the custom settings used tuned to beat up the GPU more than anything else. The RX 6800 XT stock GPU ran 78 FPS average, with Rage Mode actually improving the score by a few percentage points in this one. The overclock pushes it to 88 FPS average, landing between the 3080 OC at 92 FPS average and 3080 FE stock at 87. The 3080 FE stock holds a lead over the 6800 XT and its enraged counterpart. At 1440p, the results position the 6800 XT stock card at 139 FPS average, allowing the 3080 FE a lead of 2%, reduced from the lead it held at 4K. That's similar to what we've seen a few times now. The overclocks for each card equalizes them in this one. At 1080p, the 6800 XT holds a lead over the 3080 FE of about 2.5%, so AMD pulls a little bit ahead at the lower resolutions, while NVIDIA can leverage its bandwidth to lead at the higher resolutions. The 6800 XT OC ended up ahead of the 3090 FE stock card as a result of AMD's improved performance at resolutions closer to 1080. With Red Dead Redemption 2, we'll look at DX12 versus Vulkan scaling first, since people always bicker about which one they think should be tested, even though slightly different things are being rendered, and therefore the performance is different. AMD's RX 6800 XT is the first GPU in a long time that actually runs worse with Vulkan here. This is interesting, seeing as Vulkan had its roots in AMD's own Mantle project, while the NVIDIA RTX 3080, for instance, ran 7.5% better than its own results in Vulkan than in DX12. Given the other Vulkan limitations of RDNA 2 so far, which are being addressed, like in ray tracing, we wonder what's going on over at Vulkan's previous champion GPU maker. We're going to start reading these faster for time, and we'll focus on the 3080 and 6800 XT. If you want more info on older cards, you'll have to pause. In Red Dead 2 at 4K and DX12, the RX 6800 XT stock did 75 FPS average, improving 3% with the OC, with Rage Mode doing nothing. The 3080 FE stock therefore leads the 6800 XT stock by 13%, with the 3080 FEOC leading the 6800 XT OC by 16.5%. At 1440p, the RTX 3080 FE leads the 6800 XT by 1.9%, a significantly reduced lead from its 4K positioning. The 6800 XT's OC positions it around the 3090 FE stock result and ahead of the 3080 FEOC by 6.3%. At 1080p, the 6800 XT stock card now ties with the 3090 FE stock card. We're close to CPU limits, But the 6800 XT OC shows that there's a little bit more room left in this game. The 6800 XT stock outperformed the 3080 FE stock by 2% here, flipping the script with the OC chart topping. The 3080 scales much better at 4K, but the 6800 XT does better at 1080p. We've spent more than enough time on FPS charts, and we need to make sure this review doesn't balloon too much. A pattern has clearly been established at this point, so we're just going to flash through several other charts that we've made now, but we won't be talking through them. This is just to cut down the video time. You can pause this section if you'd like to see any detail on any particular game. The GTA 5 1080 results are interesting, but otherwise the only thing left for game discussion will be ray tracing performance. Time to briefly test ray tracing performance. We're giving this the same level of focus we gave the 30 series at launch, so low for RT. The 6800 XT does get trounced thoroughly in these results though, with Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K, bringing the 6800 XT down to 48 FPS average. We have DLSS disabled for this game. The RTX 3080 FE DLSS disabled holds an 18% lead at 56 FPS. The 6800 XT is a bit ahead of the 2080 Ti from last generation and moving to 1440p. The 6800 XT ran 86 FPS average, allowing the 3080 FE a lead of 14%. At 1080p, the 3080 FE retains a 15% lead over the 6800 XT stock card. Control is difficult. It's completely valid to play Control with DLSS, since DLSS 2 in this game is actually good, but it's also not a like-for-like comparison. To account for this, we tested both. At sort of 4K, because DLSS is on, the RTX 3080 did 65 FPS average, which is completely playable. The 6800 XT can't enable DLSS, so that one is at 23 FPS average. It'll get a feature similar to this at some point, but that's not out yet. The 3080 is therefore 180% faster with DLSS enabled. With DLSS off for all of the cards, the RTX 3080 held 37 FPS average, leading the 6800 XT still by 59%. At 1080p, the RTX 3080 FE ran 137 FPS average with DLSS, leading the 6800 XT by 95%. 70 FPS is still playable, but if you're planning to focus on RT titles or use optics, then NVIDIA is the better choice. With DLSS off, the RTX 3080 leads the 6800 XT by 51% here. With Minecraft at 4K, the RTX 3080 runs 87 FPS average, leading the 6800 XT's 14 FPS average by 529%. That is literally the highest improvement we've ever seen between two cards we're working on reviewing in one chart. The reason is that DLSS works particularly well in Minecraft, and it's a valid use of it since it all looks the same in this game anyway. The non-DLSS 3080 did 33 FPS average, falling to only a 140% advantage over the 68 XT. Finally, with Minecraft at 1080p, the 3080 did 163 FPS average with DLSS on, leading the 68 XT by 240%. If you think it is somehow invalid to allow NVIDIA to use a feature which in this situation is legitimately good specifically for Minecraft, well, with it off, the lead diminishes to 92%. AMD does well in rasterization, and it's extremely competitive there. But if you really care about ray tracing performance, you should probably still be looking at NVIDIA, assuming you can get one. Power consumption testing is up next. For this, we're using a PCIe cable and slot interposer, so this shows the total card power consumption, not the wall power consumption. We've done it this way for a few years, and this data is comparable to most of our old test data through at least 2018. For FurMark at 4K, the RX 6800 XT stock card pulled about 294 watts, putting it about 25 watts below the RTX 3080 FE card, or about 10 watts higher than the GTX 1080 Ti FTW3 stock card. Overclocking the RX 6800 XT put it at 342 watts, and although not present on this chart, our initial undervolt testing did not actually improve this number, presumably because the current increased, but we'll talk about that more in future content. The overclocked results put it alongside the aftermarket 30 series cards, particularly the overclocked ones, and about 10 watts below the RTX 3090 FE stock card. In a gaming scenario with Total War at 4K, the RX 6800 XT pulled 289 watts when stock, or 334 when overclocked. Not shown here, it was about the same at 1440p. The stock numbers have it adjacent to the 1080 Ti stock and about 30 watts higher than the ASRock 5700 XT Taichi X when it was stock, or about 30 watts below the 3080 FE when that one was stock. It's also approaching 40 watts below the 3080 Eagle when the Gigabyte card is stock. The overclocked 6800 XT numbers have it closer to the 3080 TUF when in the stock Performance V BIOS, just for reference to an aftermarket card. There was an AMD card a few generations ago that drew too much PCIe slot power, so we decided to check those numbers as well. In FurMark at 4K, the left PCIe cable did about 130 watts average, The right one did about 132 watts average, and the slot did 32.3 watts for the 12-volt rails, or 0.3 watts for the 3.3-volt rails. These numbers add up to about 302 watts, which is higher than the number we reported a moment ago for FurMark, but remember this, these are averages across several hundred cells for each one, so the global average is going to be a little bit different from secondary averages for the numbers that comprise the global, because they're measured across different periods. Ultimately, the PCIe slot is well below spec for 12 volts, which is 66 watts, so AMD is running about half of that. This table shows our raw notes for overclocking the 6800 XT. The process wasn't particularly easy. AMD still has graceless driver failures when an overclock fails, which means the screen will turn blue and become unresponsive, requiring a hard reset after a failed overclock. The tuning is also done with a minimum and maximum clock slider rather than a pure offset. We find this method to be troublesome to use and find that it produces no change sometimes in performance, while other times it produces larger swings that are pursuant to the frequency numbers you type in. For example, in some cases, clock offsets actually do nothing, but others produce the expected result, and you can see all of that in this chart. You can see also in row 19, where we increased the offset range from 2500 to 2600 in the previous row to 2530 to 2630 in this one, with an observed increase in clock of 30 megahertz, putting us up to 2485 to 2490. That's the expected behavior, but not every row was like that. And remember that the number you type in for the min and max isn't the number that it's actually running. So if you type 2500 to 2600, that doesn't mean it's running at 2600 megahertz, just before anyone posts their Reddit results of their overclocks. In the thermals column, thermals become almost uncontrollable once overclocked on this card. The trouble is that going beyond 80 to 85% fan speed starts to chew away so much at the power that the clocks were running worse at 100% fan speed. We did some undervolting, but we were unconvinced during part of this that it was doing much, as you'll see in line 17. However, we have another chart in a moment for that. It's likely more work can be done with undervolting, and we're already working on a follow-up piece. Going back to the first few rows, though, we can look at the thermal impact on frequency at play. No changes were made, but after running for a few minutes, the clocks fell from 2290 to 2312 in row 2 to 2217 to 2277 in row 3, after a subsequent increase in temperature and an auto fan speed increase. We were able to stabilize the maximum frequency offset of 150 megahertz for the memory, with AMD disallowing a further increase through official means. The clock was seemingly stable at 2590 to 2690 for the range, but the actual clock was 2528 to 2560, and this is actually an invalid OC, which is another important point before the Reddit posts start. With AMD especially, but in general with overclocking, you always have to validate overclocks to ensure there isn't a score regression. Let's look at that in a chart. Never set your overclock without checking the score change when you think it's stable, because it's not enough to just reach an assumed stability where it's not crashing anymore and then run it. The scores can actually tank with a bad OC while still presenting seemingly high clocks. We saw this last AMD launch for GPUs, where a lot of users thought they were running way higher clocks than their scores would reflect. The same happens with RTX when people run memory that isn't really stable. You will see posts online where people claim seemingly impossible frequencies, but without score validation, it's hard to say if they're legitimate. Here you'll see that our stock run was 8550 points in Time Spy Extreme, with the 2590 to 2690 clocks we showed a moment ago actually reducing the score by a massive 6.2%. We observed a small uplift going to 2500 to 2600 instead, where we produced an 8645 score, mostly improving the GT1 from the core. The test at 2550 to 2650 reduced the score again, with an undervolt to provide more power headroom, not really changing much. Undervolting appeared to help in the end though. If we highlight the last 3 rows, you'll see that we ran the same settings 3 times, but with a voltage change in the middle. We routinely produced a higher score with the voltage dropped to 1100. We tried 1090 millivolts in the settings, but it crashed. We tuned further beyond this chart for the actual in-game testing, which is why you see a bigger uplift in the game test than you do here. But it did take a good couple of hours to really dial in those clocks that we ran for the game tests. That's it for the review then. Teardown will be up shortly. Again, 6800 review, non-XT will be up shortly. For the basics of this, rasterization performance is very strong at the lower resolutions like 1080p, 1440p to some extent. And then at 4K, AMD, it's hit and miss, where they're either roughly parity within a couple FPS to the point that it just frankly doesn't matter. You just buy whichever one has an extra feature that you want, or whichever one's available or cheaper. And then as you get towards certain titles, you might get a 13% uplift, and sometimes closer to 15% depending on the exact cards you're looking at for 4K on NVIDIA, where it benefits from bandwidth and ROPS over AMD's card. But AMD has an advantage in general at 1080p 1440. So if you're really focused on 1080p high refresh gaming and you can get a high performance CPU to go with it, like Ryzen 5000 right now being the top gaming performer these days, that's still new to say, then the 6800 XT might make the most sense for that type of scenario. Whereas if you want ray tracing performance or 4K performance specifically, you probably should be looking towards NVIDIA, and especially with ray tracing performance, AMD is just not even close right now. It's not even a contest. They'll get there eventually, presumably, but this is AMD's first foray into ray tracing, real-time ray tracing. And so it's kind of in that mid, between 20 series and 30 series territory, and not quite, well, really anywhere close to the 3080 right now for the games we've tested. There are a lot more games out there. We do a pretty limited ray tracing test suite because it's never been a big focus of ours, at least not right now. There's not enough games for us to heavily focus on that. And so if you care about ray tracing, we'd encourage you to check out additional reviews by other people where they might have tested more games, just to make sure you get the full scope of how the card performs. But from what we've tested, the 3 games, dropping Quake because it doesn't work on the RX 6800 XT right now, and maybe not in the future, but dropping Quake, the 3 games we did test, NVIDIA's got a lead whether or not DLSS is on. So that's something to consider. If you're into rasterization though, definitely look into the 6800 XT some more. And as always, we'd encourage you to check out additional reviews from our peers in case there's some more that you want to learn about it, and check back for our follow-ups because we have a whole lot of them coming up, including thermal testing or improvements really to the cooler. And that is the biggest weak point of this card. We'd say probably wait for a partner model rather than getting reference, but we've been saying that for years now. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. As always, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. We'll see you all next time.